right, so in this video, we are going to take a look, sort of not in a lot of depth, but sort of a little introduction to the endocrine system. And so the endocrine system is going to be, we've talked about it a little bit in this class previously. Primarily when we think about the systems that are used to control our body, we've really been focusing on the nervous system. But the other control system of our body is the endocrine system. And so the key things about the endocrine system, it's made up of glandular tissue. And glandular tissue, again, glands are tissue that secretes something, okay? And in the case of the endocrine system, what they secrete are chemical messengers called hormones. Compared to the nervous system, the endocrine system is going to be a sort of slower and more indirect method of communication. And the communication essentially occurs when the endocrine cells release their hormone into the bloodstream, and it travels to a target tissue where that hormone then has an effect. And the target tissue has to have the correct receptors that will react to that hormone in order for the effect to occur. And remember that endocrine glands are different from exocrine glands in that endocrine glands secrete these chemical messages directly into the bloodstream, so they don't contain ducts. Now, hormones can be, there's two types of hormones. They can either be steroids or proteins, which are non-steroid hormones. So steroid hormones are made from cholesterol, which we can see here, and cholesterol is a type of lipid. So if you think back to the very beginning of the class, we talked about lipids. So lipids can actually form certain hormones. For example, the sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, are steroid hormones. The other type of hormone are protein hormones, which are proteins, so they're made from amino acids. An example of this type of hormone would be insulin. So again, that's like a string of amino acids, right? And hormones are going to interact with their target cells to alter the function of that cell. And typically they do that by telling the target cell to make a new type of protein. So here's the sort of basic step-by-step through how that works, right? So a hormone has been produced by an endocrine gland, and it's traveling through the bloodstream. Eventually, it's going to reach its target tissue. So the source gland is producing it. The target tissue is somewhere else in the body where it's going to have an effect. And so here's our steroid hormone in this example, arriving at our target tissue. Now, the tissue, not all tissues in the body are going to react to every hormone, right? Only specific tissues, specific target tissues, will react to specific hormones. And what determines whether a tissue is a target tissue of a hormone or not is going to depend on whether that tissue, which is to say the cells in that tissue, have receptors that are going to sort of match with that hormone. So the receptors are proteins, and they can either be found within the plasma membrane if the hormone is a protein, or if the protein is a steroid. Remember that steroids are lipids, and lipids can pass right through that plasma membrane. So in that case, it's just going to go right through the membrane, which we see here, and then it's going to bind to a receptor protein, which is somewhere in the cytoplasm of the cell. Okay. And these receptors basically act like switches to turn on or off gene expression. So that means they're going to have an effect on what's going on in the nucleus of the cell, which is ultimately resulting in the production of proteins. So it's causing some sort of molecular change. Most commonly, it's going to cause the activation or the synthesis, the creation of proteins. So again, a hormone is going to come to its target cell, it's going to bind to the receptor, and that's going to cause sort of a cascading effect. And you don't need to worry about all of the steps involved in this, but basically understand a series of steps will occur that results in the creation of a protein. So it's somehow altering the function of this cell by telling it to create certain proteins. And this sort of process has to be terminated somehow, right? You have to like stop sending these hormones or otherwise sort of end this process. Otherwise it will just continue, right? So many hormones have some type of a negative feedback loop that is designed to sort of turn them off after a certain point. So there are many endocrine glands, and many of these endocrine glands you will actually learn about in the second A&P course. So for example, in the digestive system, the pancreas and the liver are both endocrine glands. In the reproductive system, the gonads, which are in males the testes or in females the ovaries, are endocrine glands. Parts of the nervous system are also endocrine glands. So this is what we'll talk about in this lecture. But the hypothalamus, which is part of the brain, which is connected to the pituitary gland, these are endocrine glands. And there's also the pineal gland, which is also found as a part of the brain. And then there are some organs that are not part of these other organ systems that are just purely endocrine organs. These include the thyroid and parathyroid glands, which are these glands that are found up in the neck, and the adrenal glands, which are glands that sit on top of the kidneys. Some of these glands require input from the central nervous system, and others work completely independent of the central nervous system. So the endocrine system can work with the central nervous system. They can coordinate with each other, but it can also be a completely separate system of control for the body. And so what I want to look at briefly here is to look at the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands. So recall that the hypothalamus is this region right here, and it's part of the diencephalon, which we see here in yellow, which is part of the brain. And it's connected to the pituitary gland here. And so the hypothalamus and pituitary gland work together to regulate our hormones. And if we look at the pituitary gland, if we zoom in on it here, we can actually see that it has two parts. It has an anterior and a posterior part. And these are actually really two distinct glands. So the anterior pituitary is also called the adenohypophysis. It actually synthesizes and secretes hormones. So it is a true endocrine gland that produces hormones and secretes them. The posterior part of the pituitary gland, called the neurohypophysis, it actually just stores hormones that have been produced by the hypothalamus. So it's not a true gland in the sense that it itself does not actually create hormones. It just stores them and then releases them. It's really an extension of the hypothalamus, so an extension of that neural tissue. And the pituitary gland regulates many other endocrine organs throughout the body. And this sort of system of regulation is called an axis because it involves the pituitary gland controlling lots of other organs in the body. And so let's take a look at sort of generally how that works typically. So we can refer to this as the hypothalamic pituitary axis. So this is the hypothalamus, the anterior part of the pituitary gland, and then another endocrine organ, and then its target. Okay, so typically what happens is the hypothalamus, there are actually neurons in the hypothalamus. This is pretty cool. Neurons that produce hormones. So that's a pretty unique type of neuron, right, that is producing hormones. These neurons produce hormones. Typically, it is some type of releasing hormone. So it'll have an RH in it. So RH, a releasing hormone, is created by the hypothalamus. RH is going to trigger the anterior pituitary gland to release a hormone, which we'll call hormone 1 here, okay? So RH triggers the release of hormone 1. Hormone 1 is going to travel through the bloodstream, and it's going to reach another endocrine organ. When it reaches that endocrine organ, it's going to direct that organ to produce hormone 2. So that other organ is now producing a different hormone, okay, hormone 2. And it's hormone 2 that is actually going to cause a change in its target tissue. Right? So you have this sort of series of events that occurs, right? It's not as simple as saying that the hypothalamus, for example, releases a hormone that goes straight to its target. Instead, you have all of these intermediaries, right? Hormone 1 and then hormone 2. What also often happens is that hormone 2 typically is going to initiate a negative feedback loop. So hormone 2, once it's in the bloodstream, it's actually some of that blood is going to come back to the hypothalamus and is then going to inhibit, so it's going to decrease the production of the Rh hormone, therefore sort of putting an end to this whole cycle. Okay, so this is sort of a general overview of the endocrine system and sort of an example of how the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland can work together to control other endocrine organs. And we will look at more specifically in the next couple of lectures how certain hormones affect the skeleton.